The wind howled across the cracked earth, carrying the scent of sage and old blood. It swept through the canyon, clawing at the mesquite trees, their branches twisted like the fingers of a man reaching for something long gone. The sun hung low, a bruised orange smearing the horizon, its light spilling over the badlands of the Arizona Territory. 1889. The land was a living thing, vast and unforgiving, its silence louder than any scream. A man rode alone, his shadow stretching long across the red dirt. His eyes were gray as river stones worn smooth by years of water, though no water flowed here now. His hands, calloused and stained with earth, gripped the reins of a Dunmore, her ribs sharp under her hide. He was a rancher, or had been, before. The world took more than it gave. His name was not spoken, not even in his own mind. It had been years since anyone called it. He saw her before he heard her. A shape dangling in the distance, swaying like a broken pendulum against the gnarled trunk of a cottonwood. The rope creaked, taut around her wrists, her bare feet brushing the dust. A crude sign hung from her neck, the words scrawled in charcoal. "White man don't forgive." Her hair, black as a raven's wing, fell across her face, hiding her eyes. She was young Apache, her skin bruised like the sky before a storm. She was alive, but only just. The man stopped his mare. His breath caught, a dry rasp in his throat. He dismounted, boots crunching on the parched ground, and approached slow, like a hunter wary of a trap. The wind pushed at his back, urging him forward. He drew a knife from his belt, its blade dulled by years of cutting things that didn't need to be sharp. The rope parted with a snap, and she fell into his arms, light as a child, heavy as guilt. Carried her to the mare, her fevered skin burning through his shirt. Her silence was a weight, heavier than the sign still around her neck. He tore it off, the wood splintering in his hands, and let it fall to the dirt. The wind took it, tumbling it into the thorns. He draped her across the saddle, her body limp, her breath shallow as the desert's pulse. The mare snorted, uneasy, but he whispered to her, a low sound like water over stones, and she stilled. The ride back to his ranch was long, the sun sinking into the earth, leaving only a faint glow to guide them. The house stood alone, a squat shape of adobe and weathered wood, its roof sagging like an old man's shoulders. Inside, it smelled of dust and time. He laid her on a cot in the corner, her body curling into itself, a seed unplanted. He lit a lantern, its flame flickering like a thought he couldn't hold dot. Her wounds were many. Bruises bloomed across her arms, her ribs, her face. A cut above her eye wept blood, slow and dark. He boiled water over a fire that spat sparks into the chimney. With a cloth, he cleaned her wounds, his hands steady but slow, as if each touch might break her further. She did not flinch, did not speak. Her eyes, when they opened, were black as the night outside, watching him like a hawk watches the horizon. He gave her a name in his mind, Clara. It was not hers, but it was something to hold on to, like a stone in a river. The fire crackled, the only sound in the house. Outside, the wind sang its endless song, rattling the shutters, whispering of things left behind. He sat by the cot, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes on the floor. The silence between them was a canyon, wide and deep, but he felt its edges softening, like earth worn down by rain. Morning came, gray and heavy. He found a boot print in the yard, not his own. It was fresh, the tread sharp, military. His jaw tightened, a muscle flickering like a flame. He scanned the horizon, the hills jagged as broken teeth. Nothing moved but the wind. He returned to the house, his shadow falling across her cot. She was awake, sitting up, her back straight as a blade. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw not fear, but something sharper, like the glint of a knife. He offered her water in a tin cup, his fingers brushing hers as she took it. She drank slowly, her throat moving like a river finding its way. He turned away, busying himself with the fire, but he felt her gaze on his back, heavy as a hand. The air in the house was thick, not with words, but with the weight of what went. Unsaid, he knew she was no ordinary fugitive. She carried something broken, something sacred, like a shard of glass catching light. The day passed in silence. He chopped wood, the axe biting deep, each swing a prayer for clarity. She watched from the window, her silhouette framed by the warped glass. The land outside was a painting of rust and bone, the mountains looming like judges. He felt the danger. Circling, a vulture waiting for death. The bootprint burned in his mind, a warning written in the earth. The sun climbed slow, a weary traveler scaling the sky. Its light spilled over the badlands, turning the sagebrush to silver and the red earth to fire. The rancher stood outside, his boots rooted in the dirt, his eyes tracing the horizon where the hills met the heavens. The wind was quieter today, a low murmur like a secret half told. It carried the scent of creosote and something sharper, like iron or fear. The bootprint lingered in his mind, a scar on the earth that matched the one in his chest dot inside. The girl he called Clara sat by the window, her knees drawn up, her hands folded like a prayer she didn't believe in. Her bruises had darkened, purple as dusk, but her fever had broken. She was a shadow of strength, her silence louder than the creak of the floorboards. He watched her from the doorway, his hands heavy at his sides. She didn't turn, but he felt her awareness, sharp as a blade's edge. He brought her a plate of cornbread and beans, setting it on the table without a word. She looked at it, then at him, her eyes like deep wells reflecting starlight. She ate slowly, each bite deliberate, as if tasting something beyond the food. He sat across from her, his own plate untouched, the space between them thick with unspoken questions. The house groaned under the weight of the sun, its timbers sighing like old bones. Outside, a hawk circled, its cry slicing the air. He stood, his chair scraping the floor, and checked the rifle by the door. It was old, its barrel pitted like the face of a man who'd seen too much. He loaded it, the click of each cartridge a small defiance against the quiet. She watched him, her gaze steady, unyielding. He met her eyes, and for a moment, the world narrowed to that single point of connection, like a stone dropped in a still pond. The afternoon burned on, the heat pressing against the adobe walls. He worked the ranch, mending a fence, his hammer, striking nails with a rhythm that matched his pulse. Sweat beaded on his brow, falling to the earth like offerings. He felt her presence behind him, not close but near enough, her shadow blending with the mesquites. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her silence was a language, and he was learning its cadence. Night fell, a curtain of indigo drawn across. The sky, stars blinked like eyes watching from above. He built a fire in the hearth, its flames licking the air, casting shadows that danced like ghosts. She sat cross-legged on the floor, her fingers tracing patterns in the dust. He watched, his breath catching as her hand shaped the bird, its wings spread, surrounded by flames. The symbol burned into his mind, a story he couldn't yet read. He knelt beside her, the fire's heat on his face. "Who did this to you?" His voice was low, rough as gravel. She didn't answer, but her hand stilled, her fingers curling into the dirt. Her eyes lifted to his, and in them he saw a storm gathering, dark and fierce. She drew a line in the dust, then another, until the scene took shape. A village, huts aflame, bodies scattered like leaves, her family gone, blamed for a death they didn't cause. Her silence broke, not with words, but with a single sharp breath, like a blade cutting through cloth. He sat back, his heart heavy as stone. The fire cracked, spitting embers. He saw his own past in her drawing, his sister's face flickering in the flames. A raid years ago, hooves thundering, screams swallowed by the night. He hadn't saved her. The guilt was a riverbed, dry but deep, cutting through him. He looked at Clara, and something shifted, like a stone rolling away from a buried spring. He reached for her hand, hesitant, his fingers hovering above hers. She didn't pull away. Their hands met, rough skin against bruised, a touch as fragile as the flame between them. The air hummed, taut as a bowstring. He wanted to speak, to confess, but the words were ash in his throat. Instead, he stood, fetching a blanket from the cot, and draped it over her shoulders. She clutched it, her fingers tightening, and in that small act, he felt a thread of trust, thin but unbroken. The night deepened, the wind rising again, rattling the shutters like a warning. He lay on the floor by the fire, his rifle within reach, his eyes on the ceiling. She slept on the cot, her breath a soft rhythm, like waves on a distant shore. He didn't sleep. The boot print haunted him, a promise of trouble riding closer. The land outside was a witness, its silence holding secrets older than either of them. That morning brought a knock at the door, sharp as a gunshot. He rose his hand. On the rifle, his heart a drumbeat. Through the window, he saw a man in a cavalry uniform, his hat low, his eyes scanning the yard like a predator. The rancher opened the door, his face a mask of stone. The officer's voice was clipped, cold as iron, looking for a fugitive. Apache girl killed a white woman. The rancher's jaw tightened, his gray eyes unyielding. Ain't seen her. The lie was a weight, heavy as the girl sleeping inside. The officer lingered, his gaze probing, but the rancher stood firm. A cliff against the tide. The man left, his horse's hooves kicking up dust that hung in the air like a threat. He closed the door, his back against it, his breath slow and deliberate. Clara was awake, standing in the corner, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with something fiercer, like a flame refusing to die. He nodded, a single motion, and she understood. The canyon between them was narrowing, its edges softened by the weight of their shared silence. The sun clawed its way higher, painting the badlands in gold and shadow. The air was heavy, thick with the promise of heat, the kind that pressed into the skin like a brand. The rancher stood in the yard, his eyes scanning the hills, jagged as a broken spine against the sky. The wind was restless, tugging at his coat, whispering of hoofbeats not yet heard. The land watched, its silence a mirror to his own, reflecting the weight of choices made in the dark. Inside, the girl he called. Clara moved like a shadow, her steps light but deliberate, as if the floor might betray her. Her bruises were fading, but her eyes carried a deeper wound, one that bled without blood. She wore his old shirt, too big for her frame, the sleeves rolled up to reveal wrists still raw from rope. He noticed the way she held herself, straight as a young pine, rooted against the storm she knew was coming. He boiled coffee over the fire, the pot hissing like a warning. He poured her a cup, the steam curling between them like a ghost. She took it, her fingers brushing his, a fleeting warmth that lingered in his bones. They sat at the table, the silence between them taut as a drawn bow. He wanted to ask her name, her real one, but the question felt like a stone too heavy to lift. Instead, he watched her sip the coffee, her lips careful, her eyes distant, as if seeing a place he could never follow. The day stretched long, the sun a relentless eye. He worked the corral, his hands busy with rope and wood, but his mind was elsewhere, circling the bootprint, the officer's cold gaze. The hills loomed, their shadows creeping closer as the light waned. Clara stayed near the house, her presence a quiet anchor. She swept the porch, her movements slow, each stroke of the broom a small act of defiance against the dust that claimed everything. Night fell, a velvet curtain studded with stars. The fire in the hearth was low, its embers glowing like memories. She sat by it, her knees drawn up, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket he'd given her. He joined her, the floor hard beneath him, the rifle close. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and unspoken truths. She looked at him, her eyes catching the firelight, and he felt the weight of her story pressing against his own. He spoke first, his voice a low rumble, like thunder far off. "Lost my sister. Long time ago. Raid came at night. Couldn't stop it." The words were sharp, cutting his throat as they left. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the flames, but he felt her shift, her silence softening. She reached into the dirt by the hearth, her fingers drawing again. A bird, wings aflame, rising from ash. She pointed to it, then to herself. And he understood. Her family, her home, burned for a lie. A white woman's death, pinned on her people. Her name was not Clara, but he held on to it, a tether in the dark. He leaned closer, his hand hovering over the drawing, then settling beside. Hers. Their fingers didn't touch, but the space between them hummed, alive with possibility. She looked at him, her eyes fierce and fragile, like a river frozen under moonlight. He wanted to speak, to promise safety, but the words were dust. Instead, he rose, fetching his coat from the peg, and draped it over her shoulders. She pulled it tight, her breath catching, a sound so small it nearly drowned in the fire's crackle. They sat through the night, the silence a bridge between them. He saw her in fragments, the curve of her jaw, the way her hair fell like a shadow, the strength in her hands despite their wounds. His own heart was a dry riverbed, cracked but stirring, as if her presence was rain he hadn't expected. The wind outside grew restless, howling through the mesquite, carrying the scent of trouble. Dawn broke, gray and sharp. He was outside, checking the moray, when he heard the sound, hooves heavy and deliberate, kicking up dust like a storm. 3 men rode into the yard, their faces hard, their eyes glinting with purpose. Locals, not soldiers, but just as dangerous. Their leader, a man with a scar like a lightning bolt across his cheek, spoke without dismounting. "Heard you got an Apache girl. Kill her. Hand her over." The rancher stood still, his hands loose at his sides, his eyes gray as storm clouds. "Ain't nobody here but me." The lie was a stone dropped in a well, its ripples spreading through. The air, the men exchanged glances, their hands twitching toward holsters. The leader's horse snorted, pawing the earth, and the rancher felt the land itself tense, its silence a held breath. The men didn't believe him. Their eyes roamed the house, the corral, the hills beyond. The leader spat, his voice low. "You're making a mistake, rancher." They turned their horses, dust rising like smoke, but their departure felt like a promise, not a retreat. He watched them go, his heart a drumbeat, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. He returned to the house, his boots heavy on the porch. Clara stood by the window, her silhouette sharp against the morning light. She'd heard everything, her eyes wide but unafraid, like a hawk ready to take flight. He crossed to her, his hand reaching out, then stopping short. "They'll be back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her fingers tightening on the coat, her silence louder than any vow. That night, he built the fire high, its flames licking the chimney like a warning. He took the sign, the one he'd torn from her neck days ago, and fed it to the flames. The words "white man don't forgive" curled into ash, their hatred consumed by the fire's hunger. She stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his, a touch so light it might have been the wind. But it wasn't. The firelight painted her face, her eyes reflecting the blaze, and he saw something new, not just pain, but defiance, a spark that refused to die. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence was their language now, woven from shared glances, small gestures, the weight of choices made without words. The land outside watched, its hills dark and silent, holding their secrets close. But inside, the fire burned, and for the first time, the rancher felt something. Like hope, fragile as a flame in the wind. The moon hung low, a sickle of bone slicing the night sky. Its light spilled over the badlands, silvering the sagebrush and casting shadows sharp as knives. The wind was a restless spirit, moaning through the canyons, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. The rancher stood outside, his breath misting in the cold, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the hills stood like sentinels. The land was alive, its pulse slow but unyielding, whispering of time running thinned out inside. The girl he called Clara packed a satchel with quiet precision. Her hands moved deftly, folding a blanket, tucking away cornbread wrapped in cloth. Her fingers steady despite the raw marks on her wrists. Her silence was a river, deep and swift, carrying truths too heavy for words. He watched her from the doorway, his shadow falling across the floor like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Her eyes met his, black as obsidian, and in them he saw fire kindled, not by anger but by something fiercer, the will to live. He crossed to the hearth, the fire now a pile of glowing coals. He added a log, the flames flaring briefly, casting their faces in gold. "We go tonight," he said, his voice low, like stones shifting in a dry creek. She nodded, her gaze never leaving his, her hands pausing only to tighten the satchel strap. The air between them was taut, a thread stretched to breaking, woven from trust and fear and something unspoken. Fragile as frost, he saddled the mare under the moon's cold gaze, his hands working the leather with care, each knot a prayer for speed. The horse snorted, her breath a white cloud, her eyes wide with the night's unease. Clara emerged from the house, the satchel slung across her shoulder, his coat draped over her like a shield. She moved like a shadow, silent but sure, her presence a weight he felt in his chest. He helped her onto the mare, his hand lingering on hers, a touch that burned like the memory of fire. They rode south, the night swallowing their tracks. The badlands stretched endless, their cliffs and mesas carved by time's patient hand. The stars above were a map, guiding them toward the Sierra Madres, where whispers spoke of Apache still free, unbowed by the weight of the white man's world. The rancher's heart was a drum, steady but heavy, each beat marking the distance between. Safety and the shadow of pursuit. Dawn broke, pale and thin, the sun a faint glow behind a veil of clouds. They stopped in a narrow canyon, its walls rising like the ribs of some ancient beast. A trickle of water ran through its heart, catching the light like a vein of silver. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the damp earth, and led the mare. To drink, Clara slid down beside him, her movements careful, her eyes scanning the cliffs above. The silence was a third companion, wrapping them in its heavy embrace. He built a small fire, its smoke curling like a question. They shared the cornbread, their fingers brushing as they passed the cloth, a touch that spoke louder than words. The canyon watched, its walls etched with the memory of floods, its air sharp with the scent of wet stone. He saw her relax, just a fraction, her shoulders easing as she leaned against a boulder. But her eyes never stopped moving, hawk-like, searching for the shadow of hooves. The shot came without warning, a crack that split the morning. The Maori reared, her scream echoing off the canyon walls. The rancher fell, a bloom of red spreading. Across his side, the pain a white-hot blade. Clara was at his side in an instant, her hands pressing against the wound, her face a mask of stone. Blood seeped through her fingers, warm and relentless. Staining the earth like an offering dot, she tore a strip from his coat, binding the wound with fierce precision, her hands shaking only slightly. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw not panic, but a fire unyielding, like the bird she'd drawn in the dirt. She whispered something, a word in her tongue, soft as a prayer, sharp as a vow. He didn't understand it, but he felt its weight, like a stone placed over his heart. Voices echoed above, harsh and close. The men from the ranch, their shadows moving across the canyon's rim. Clara pulled him to his feet, her strength a surprise, her arm around him like a root anchoring a tree. They stumbled toward the Maori, his vision blurring, the world tilting like a ship in a storm. She mounted first, pulling him up behind her, his arms weak around her waist. The Maori surged forward, hooves pounding the earth, the canyon narrowing. Around them like a throat, the pass was tight, a slit in the mountain's heart, its walls scraping their shoulders as they rode. Bullets sang past, chipping stone, their whine a chorus of death. Clara leaned low, urging the Maori faster, her breath a steady rhythm against the chaos. He clung to her, his blood soaking her back, his life seeping into her like a debt. The pass opened, the sky widening above, and the voices faded, swallowed by the wind. They stopped by a river, its waters slow and clear, reflecting the clouds like a mirror. She eased him to the ground, her hands gentle now, her face tight with focus. She built a tent from branches, and the blanket, a fragile shelter against the world. The river sang, its voice soft but constant, washing away the blood on her hands as she worked. She cleaned his wound again, her touch a quiet apology, her eyes never leaving his. He woke to moonlight, the river's song louder now, a lullaby for the broken. She sat beside him, her knees drawn up, her hair falling like a curtain. "Ayana," she said, her voice a whisper, like water over stones. "My name." He repeated it, the word heavy on his tongue, a gift he didn't deserve. "Ayana," he said again, and her eyes softened, like the river catching the moon. The pain was a distant fire, banked but burning. He reached for her hand, his fingers weak but sure. She took it, her grip firm, and in that touch he felt the canyon between them close, its edges smoothed by time and trust. The river flowed on, its waters carrying their silence, their wounds, their fragile hope, toward a place where the past might loosen its grip. The river ran soft, its waters weaving through the Sierra Madres like threads of silver in a dark tapestry. Dawn crept over the mountains, a pale light touching the peaks, their edges sharp as grief. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, a world apart from the dry bones of the Badlands. The land here was alive, its pulse steady in the rustle of leaves, the murmur of the current, the distant call of a wolf. It watched, not with judgment, but with patience, as if waiting for the living to find their place. The rancher lay in the tent, his breath shallow but steady, the wound in his side a dull ache, like a fire banked low. His eyes gray as weathered. Stone followed Ayana as she moved. She knelt by the river, filling a canteen, her hands steady despite the weight of the days behind them. Her hair caught the morning light, black as a raven's wing, swaying as she worked. She was no longer Clara, not a name borrowed from his guilt, but Ayana, a peaceful river carving its own path through stone. He watched her, his heart a quiet drum, each beat a tether to the world. She returned, her steps silent on the soft earth, and offered him the canteen. Their fingers brushed, a spark in the cold dawn, and he drank, the water sharp and clean, like a memory of something he'd forgotten. Her eyes met his, dark and deep, holding a story that needed no words. The silence between them was a language, now woven from glances, gestures. The way her hand lingered near his as she adjusted the blanket. Days passed, each one a slow healing. The river was their companion, its song a constant thread through the hours. Ayana hunted, her movements swift and sure, returning with a rabbit or a clutch of roots, her hands stained with earth. She cooked over a small fire, the smoke curling. Like a prayer, and they ate in silence, the act of sharing a ritual heavier than words. He grew stronger, his body knitting itself together, but the wound in his chest, the one no bullet had made, was slower to mend. One evening, as the sun bled, red into the horizon, she sat beside him, her knees drawn up, her fingers tracing the edge of the canteen. The firelight painted her face, softening the lines of pain, kindling the spark in her eyes. He reached for her, his hand slow, as if afraid to break the moment. She leaned into his touch, her cheek against his palm, and the world stilled. River's song fading to a whisper. Their lips met, a kiss soft as the wind, heavy with unspoken vows. It was not passion, but something deeper, like roots finding water in parched earth. Months turned, the seasons shifting like a slow tide. They built a lodge by the river, its walls of pine and stone rising under their hands. The work was slow, deliberate, each log placed with care, each stone a promise. The land embraced them, its trees standing guard, its waters offering sustenance. Ayana's laughter came one day, a sound like a bell in the quiet, when a fish slipped from her hands. Back into the river. He smiled, the first in years, his face cracking open like dry ground after rain. Her belly grew, a gentle curve under the shirt she wore, his shirt now hers. He watched her move through the days, her strength a quiet fire, her presence a balm to the ache he'd carried too long. They worked side by side, planting seeds in the soft earth, their hands brushing in the dirt, their silence a shared prayer. The river flowed on, its waters reflecting the sky, the trees, the life they were building from Ashdod one night. Under a sky thick with stars, they sat by the fire outside the lodge. The air was crisp, scented with pine and smoke. She rested her head against his shoulder, her hand on her belly, and he felt the weight of their future, fragile but real. He thought of his sister, her face fading in the firelight, her loss a scar that no longer bled. He thought of Ayana's family, their names carried by the wind, their memory honored in the life she carried. He spoke, his voice low, like the river's murmur. "We're free here." She nodded, her eyes on the flames, her hand tightening on his. The words were simple, but they held the weight of the canyon they'd crossed, the blood they'd shed, the trust they'd built from silence. The land listened, its silence a mirror, reflecting not vengeance but healing, not hatred but love. The stars burned bright, a map of light above the lodge. The river sang, its voice weaving through the night, carrying their story downstream. They sat together, two souls bound by choice, their roots deep in the earth, their hearts open to the quiet power of peace. The past was a shadow, fading in. The light of what they'd made, and the land, ever watchful, held them close, its embrace as vast as the sky.